Now let's welcome our next speaker, which is Ajai Malhotra, who is a former diplomat, served for the Indian government in the UN, in Russia, in Romania, Albania, Moldavia, and Kuwait, and now acts in several environmental organizations. And the title of his presentation is The Non-Sustainability of Inequality. Please.
Professor Hans Groth, Peter, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak on the non-sustainability of inequality in the context of your discussions on future economic systems, and also for the warm hospitality extended to me in this very beautiful Swiss alpine resort. You know, the past century has witnessed countries pursuing political ideologies and socio-economic systems based on different ways of organizing human society. The revealed weaknesses of communism, socialism, capitalism, and other systems have highlighted the need to continue to look for ways to more effectively secure human advancement. While democracy has spread further in recent decades, and I agree the point that was made, the question raised from the floor to the previous speaker, this has been accompanied by a shift away from the idea that democracy has to go hand in hand with unbridled capitalism. There's been a deeper appreciation of the need to transcend national priorities and pursue the long-term interests of our planet and the diverse life forms that inhabit it. The world's fixation on economic growth is being replaced by a yearning for healthier, more sustainable lifestyles with considerations like human rights and new challenges like environmental concerns and global financial crises compelling a change in approach. Progress can no longer be gauged solely using poverty, income, or wealth indicators. There's recognition that our societies have to be more inclusive and put greater emphasis on reducing inequalities, advancing the dignity of the individual, and maintaining harmony between human beings and nature while addressing developmental, environmental, and ethical concerns. A new vista opened up in this context when the 1972 UN Conference on the Human Environment, held at Stockholm, brought environmental issues into the ambit of international diplomacy. At that conference, India highlighted the link between environment and development, specifying that the environment cannot be improved in conditions of poverty. As the opening speaker of our conference mentioned, the seminal Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future, projected the concept of sustainable development, defining it as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It thus viewed economic development and environmental protection through the prism of needs, in particular the development needs of the world's poor, while highlighting the notion of intergenerational equity. By the time you had the Rio Conference on Environment and Development 5 years later, environment and development had become inextricably interlinked. And the Rio Summit reinforced the importance of finding new ways to generate economic growth and address the overriding priority, the overriding development priority of developing countries, as well as to do so without harming the environment. Over the last few decades, there's been a broader acceptance of the right to development as a collective right. This entitles not only individuals, but also peoples to economic, social, cultural, and political development. Moreover, Principle 3 of the 1992 Rio Declaration built on it by specifying that the right to development must be fulfilled so as to equitably meet developmental and environmental needs of present and future generations. With the advance of human rights, a new global consciousness encompassing a right to sustainable development is crystallizing. Its overriding priority has to be the elimination of extreme poverty alongside addressing intergenerational and intragenerational equity concerns. Moreover, besides reducing inequality in income and wealth, such a right has to incorporate a more equitable access for all to resources that cater to basic subsistence level needs. In this context, sustainable development requires acceptance of the importance of both intragenerational and intergenerational equity. We are undoubtedly trustees of our planet, but we would be less than sincere if we are concerned only about our obligations to future generations and cannot be bothered about addressing the precarious condition of the vast numbers of those in the present generation who live in grinding poverty. Yesterday, youth representatives here spoke about a sharing society. What is needed even more is a caring society. In an overwhelming majority of countries, and that is irrespective of whether they are developed or developing countries, income, wealth, political power, and resources are concentrated in the hands of a small proportion of the population. As per UNDP, and I will quote UN sources largely because some can otherwise be a little suspect, the richest 10% of the world's population currently earn around 40% of the world's income. Moreover, income inequality is rising in many countries, including developing countries, where income disparities in fact widened by 11% during 1990 to 2010. In fact, today, over 3/4 of the total population of all developing countries live in societies with more unequal incomes than they had in the 1990s. So this is something that afflicts both the developed and the developing world. As regards inequality in the distribution of wealth, several recent reports highlight that the wealthiest 1% of the world's population will soon own half the global wealth, and that chasm is widening. Massive inequality in income, wealth, political power, or access to resources that cater to basic needs is unsustainable. Why? It breeds resentment, it leads to irrational use of resources, it enhances environmental degradation, and it can generate conflict. Our aspirations for environmentally sound and sustainable development must strive for the greatest possible degree of socioeconomic and political inclusion. When I refer to access to resources, I'm using it as a short form to describe access to clean and sustainable energy, which is a major challenge facing the world today, and is fundamental to poverty eradication, and also access to food, nutrition, and to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. So presently, 2.8 billion people have no access to modern energy services, and 1.4 billion out of about 7.2 plus billion people in the world, mostly rural poor in the developing world, have no access to electricity. Moreover, annually around 4.3 million rural poor die prematurely due to indoor air pollution caused by using fuels like cow dung that are cheap and easily available but harmful to their health. Turning to water, even in Europe, if you see daily water use ranges from 200 to 300 liters per person for most countries, if not more. But if you see in African countries, it is less than 10 liters per person per day in some instances. Moreover, if you look at the number of people worldwide who live more than 1 kilometer from a water source, and that number is 884 plus million, then use of water is often less than 5 liters a day because, and that too, it is unsafe water, and this is partly because they have to carry it long distances. Close to half the people living in developing countries suffer from health problems caused by poor quality water and lack of basic sanitation. Turning to food, 1 in 9 people in the world today are undernourished, and the vast majority of them live in developing countries. Poor nutrition causes nearly 45% of deaths of children under 5 years, and 3.1 million children annually is the number that would come out of this. Against this backdrop, there's also climate disruption, which will disproportionately harm the poor and presents a global challenge with long-term sustainable development implications. The impact on our planet of anthropogenic activity since the Industrial Revolution has produced several environmental deviations. The Earth's atmosphere and oceans have warmed, sea level has risen, oceans have become more acidic. And these are not conclusions of economic modeling alone, where I agree with one of the previous speakers who said that you have to vet everything by empirical evidence. In fact, facts on the ground affirm that global temperatures have gone up 0.8 degrees centigrade, while sea levels have risen 20 centimeters over the last century. Snow, ice, permafrost, and glaciers have reduced at the poles and elsewhere. Biodiversity and ecosystems have been affected. Extreme weather events have intensified and increased. GHG, or greenhouse gas emissions, are the highest in human history. That's not surprising because we have the most number of people in human history. But atmospheric CO2 levels, carbon dioxide levels, are also at its highest level in 800,000 years. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change affirmed last year with overwhelming certainty, and those words are used carefully by them, in their 5th assessment report, that rising GHG concentrations in the atmosphere due to human activities has been the dominant cause of the observed warming of our planet since 1950. And irrespective of future emissions of GHGs, further warming is inevitable, largely due to past emissions, which have stayed in a stable form for 80 to 90 years, and those that are yet to be emitted. And this implies that the Earth's climate will continue to change. The consequences of this change respect no boundaries. I accept that. But it will intensify development challenges, and its adverse impact on the poor would be particularly severe. Rising sea levels would submerge low-lying islands and coastal lands, contaminate coastal freshwater reserves. A warmer atmosphere will spread tropical diseases and pests to new areas. Growing worldwide urbanization, which was referred to here, is already seriously challenging services and infrastructure in many stressed and densely populated coastal cities in several developing countries. And the increased unpredictability of precipitation and rainfall and the rising temperatures will reduce crop yields, while warming and acidification of the oceans will affect our fisheries. Most of the food insecure are in South Asia, where currently over 400 million poor and undernourished people live, and many of them would be disproportionately harmed. Increased drought and related water and food shortages linked to rising and extreme temperatures may increase malnutrition and worsen rural poverty. Climate-related food productivity declines will also negatively impact livelihoods through its effects on vulnerable ecosystems. Again, if you see, there are also disasters, conflicts, and inequality that need to be looked at. The poor and the vulnerable, irrespective of whether they are in developed or developing countries, are particularly exposed to natural or man-made disasters, and their post-disaster recovery is more complicated also. It is starkly revealing that 9 out of 10 disaster-related deaths occur in low and middle-income countries. Besides saving lives, investing in disaster prevention delivers a consistently superior return compared to financing post-disaster reconstruction. Yet there is a predisposition to avoid or delay expenditure on disaster prevention as it counts for little, and voters in comparison it counts for little with voters in comparison to post-disaster assistance. In fact, the UN Secretary General in March 2015 at a conference in Japan pointed out that spending $6 billion annually on disaster prevention over the next 15 years, that is $90 billion, could save $360 billion by 2030. So concerted efforts are needed in these directions, and these are also essential if the income and wealth gaps are to be reined in and reversed. Otherwise, you'll have the opposite happening with these increasing disasters. Greater attention also needs to be given to the conditions of refugees and internally displaced persons escaping natural or man-made disasters or conflicts. And we see some of that also coming to Europe at the moment. So reducing inequality and eliminating poverty. Wide inequality in access, entitlements, and opportunities represent undesirable aspects of the way human societies are presently organized. Indeed, widening inequalities can undermine poverty reduction efforts and negatively impact an underprivileged person's sense of self-worth. Recently, an IMF paper on causes and consequences of income inequality frankly acknowledged that in advanced economies, the gap, and I'm quoting this, in advanced economies, the gap between the rich and poor is at its highest level in decades. Inequality trends have been more mixed in emerging markets and developing countries, with some countries experiencing declining inequality, but pervasive inequities in access to education, healthcare, and finance remain. I would say that extreme poverty cannot be eliminated as long as glaring inequalities persist amongst and within countries. Nonetheless, rising income inequality is not inevitable, and countries have been able to contain or reduce income inequality alongside strong growth, but examples are few and far between. Against this backdrop, it is satisfying that recognition of the need for greater fairness, greater justice, and equity has emerged as one of the central outcomes of international negotiations on a post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda. Late last month, as many of you would know, a new action agenda on sustainable development, looking to the next 15 years, was endorsed by world leaders at the UN in New York. These are not legally binding, but the 17 Sustainable Development Targets, or SDGs as they're known, and 169 targets unanimously agreed to, and this is important, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, which are not negotiated, these are negotiated goals, unanimously agreed to on 25 September 2015, represent a defining contribution to international efforts to address socioeconomic and environmental challenges confronting humanity. These SDGs correctly assign, in my view, pride of place to the goal of eradicating poverty, extreme poverty in particular, and followed by ending hunger and consequently achieving improved nutrition and promoting sustainable agriculture, which are linked. Time does not permit me to go through the 17 goals, but I think it is pertinent that the world community has endorsed a separate SDG, SDG 10, on reducing inequality within and amongst countries, because that is really what we're focusing on. This is an outcome of negotiation endorsed by world leaders of all the countries of the world. What does SDG 10 do? It assigns all states a target to progressively achieve and sustain income growth of the bottom 40% of the population at a rate higher than the national average. Not much, but better than nothing if they not address this issue at all. Happily, countries will think global, but they'll act local. I think that's the right way to go. I entirely agree with the previous presentation on this. Prescriptive or one-size-fits-all approach has been avoided, and determining the mix of policies needed to empower the bottom 40 percentile of income earners has been left to the discretion of each UN member country. Inequalities extend beyond the rich-poor gap in income, wealth, political power, and access, because they also manifest themselves, for example, through urban-rural, generational, and digital divides, besides gender inequalities. Accordingly, states have also agreed via SDG 10, by the same goal, to empower and promote the social, economic, and political inclusion of all, irrespective of age, sex, disability, race, ethnicity, etc., and to do so by 2030. Let me give you 2 or 3 figures here that might be relevant looking at the previous discussions I've heard. Firstly, children of the poorest 20% of the population, and I'm giving this in the context of developing countries. I'm not saying that developed countries or developing countries, it's not a clash of interests. Children of the poorest 20% of the population in developing countries are up to 3 times more likely to die before their 5th birthday than those of the richest 20% in developing countries. And reflecting the urban-rural divide or schism, rural women in most developing countries are up to 3 times more likely to die while giving birth than are their urban counterparts. I also want to mention that there's a sharp digital inequality that needs to be surmounted if we are to provide more equal access to the internet and to other new technologies, which we've heard several lectures on. In fact, more than 4 billion people do not have internet access, and 90% of the digitally excluded live in developing countries. So what has to be done? I think the contemporary socio-political landscape has witnessed a growing acknowledgement of the ethical responsibilities of the haves towards the have-nots. And for our increasingly interconnected world to function as, if we are to function as one caring family, each of its members must have the opportunity to live a life of dignity in a clean, safe, and healthy environment. What does this require? it requires at a minimum that everyone have a minimum level of access to health and sanitation, education, housing and livelihood, besides to nutritious food, potable water, and affordable energy. Here I'm talking a minimal level of access. So eradicating hunger and ensuring adequate nutrition, as well as spreading education and healthcare, are crucial to tackling poverty. Yet, and this relates to discussions I've heard here, even eliminating extreme poverty will not automatically address equality concerns. We have to separately focus, in addition, on addressing low upward socioeconomic mobility amongst the poor, which often leaves them left behind or trapped in an underprivileged situation that may sometimes persist or extend over several generations. While development has in the past taken place at the cost of the environment, developing countries would like to avoid the unsustainable development trajectory that was earlier inadvertently followed by many developed countries. We do realize that we can have a similar level of well-being as the developed world without proceeding down a path of wasteful consumption, but we need the cooperation of the developed world for doing so. There's also a recognition that income inequality cannot be effectively tackled unless underlying inequality in opportunities is also addressed. While every human being is entitled to an equal atmospheric space in pursuit of sustainable development, it is revealing from the perspective of climate justice that approximately 60% of GHGs are presently emitted by the richest 1 billion people in the world, while the bottom 1 billion of the Earth's inhabitants emit about 5% of GHGs. And yet this is most certainly one area in which the poor or developing countries do not want to catch up. Instead, cleaner as well as renewable energy technologies have to be made more affordable and increasingly brought within everybody's reach. Again, this change is now underway, especially as it regards solar energy. I would say that carrying out joint research on targeted clean and renewable energy technologies would also help developing countries along a low-carbon growth pathway in pursuit of development. Some low-carbon development options may be less costly for countries like India in the long run and could offer new economic opportunities. Indeed, inclusive growth that benefits all is integral to an effective sustainable development policy that incorporates actions on climate change. A major Indian study last year has shown that for India, low-carbon growth pathways are entirely consistent with inclusive growth. Finally, a word on global partnership on financing and technologies. In fact, it is a concluding goal on the list of the 17 SDGs agreed to under the agenda for the year 2030. SDG 17 incorporates provisions for strengthening domestic resource mobilization and support in attaining long-term debt sustainability. It also requires developed countries to fully implement their long-standing ODA commitments, which I do not see happening, though. And a green climate fund has been set up in 2009 to make critical technologies freely available, but contributions to it have been a measly $10 billion against what was targeted by the world community as $100 billion per year starting 2020. As the Indian Prime Minister said at the UN post-2015 Development Agenda Summit last month, it is hoped that the developed world will fulfill its financing commitments for development and climate change without in any way putting both under the same head. And I think what is meant by that is you're talking of new and additional funding rather than just saying development has gone to climate finance. Finally, enhanced cooperation is envisaged on access to science, technology, innovation, and knowledge sharing, including through a global technology facilitation mechanism. A healthier global partnership in line with SDG 17 would enable the developing world to more effectively access development and climate finance and environmentally sound technologies, besides boosting capacity development. This also means encouraging ODA flows to regions where their requirement is greatest. India does support such flows, and we're not looking at it for ourselves, but there are other countries out there who would benefit from funding because they don't have the money to tackle the problems confronting them, and they are not part of many of the problems that have now come upon them. A mechanism that identifies new environmentally clean technologies as a global public good and facilitates their sharing with the developing world on concessional and preferential terms would be useful. And this is also envisaged under the SDG 17. Let's see how it pans out. But the point is we cannot leave have-nots at the mercy of a purely market-driven system that focuses solely on private commercial benefit. Looking ahead, the extent of inequality within and amongst countries has to be reduced if we want to have a more just, peaceful, and sustainable world. No country acting on its own can successfully achieve such a change. The SDGs provide us now with a template for each country to assess its performance in meeting a wide-ranging set of goals, with the bar being placed not so high as to make these goals unachievable, or so low as to make them meaningless. What has to be done? All stakeholders will need to sincerely cooperate in a spirit of partnership if we are to attain the Sustainable Development Goals by the year 2030. Thank you. I'd be happy to respond to questions.
Very nice. Thank you very much for the presentation. And we have a short moment of time for questions and comments on the presentation. Yeah, please.
Thank you for the input. It's the first presentation of a former ambassador I've heard. You talked a lot about cooperation between countries, but don't you think that in some cases, some countries, and now without trying to be disrespectful, for example, India, should tackle mentality problems like gender inequality on its own, because you cannot force gender equality as an outsider. And we know that there's this still big problem, not only in India, in Africa also, that firstly has to be tackled before you tackle other problems like CO2 emissions, for example. Thank you.
Let me say that I entirely endorse what you're saying. Gender inequality has to be tackled in each country. In fact, the merit of the SDGs that we have agreed to, these are negotiated targets, but every country has to achieve it on its own. The action has to be within the country. The action has to be even within the country at the local level. So it's not that anyone is talking about cooperation on tackling gender inequality, but we have agreed that all of us will work together, and this is what we're aiming at. It's hugely important, and the only way to do it is in your own country. In fact, within your country, within your state, within your region, within your city, within your village and community. That's the only way to handle it. I entirely endorse that. That is also the view of the world when we address this issue.
Right. I might, in conclusion, come up with a last question, because this is, as you might know, touching upon part of my CV, as I was at the same university as you in Delhi. And I remember a book called Competing Inequalities from an American development economist, saying that the quota programs, by trying to actually nivellate inequalities, create new inequalities by those getting privileges of inequalities. That is an interesting intellectual way of paradoxically phrasing the cultural engravements of the system, and I would be curious to see how you would maybe embed this in the overall framework of the Global Sustainability Network.
Yeah, you are again correct in saying that. We did follow a pattern of quotas and reservation in India to help those who had been underprivileged maybe for generations. But then you have to decide when you have to put a full stop to that. When do you say that, yes, enough opportunities have been given to access, because you find that some avail of it better, and then as generations go down, it might even end up being misused, whereas others who were denied the opportunity find that they don't have those possibilities. In some parts of India, in fact, I don't want to make this India focus as a discussion, but we had one state where the reservation of the quota was more than 50% for groups that were clearly small groups. And as a result, you had issues with larger communities who felt somehow that they are being not treated properly. So that is an issue. I don't think we have an answer as to where we have to stop on that. But clearly, unless you do something to help those in an underprivileged position, you won't get anywhere. That's the start of where we...
Right. I've seen there's one concluding remark.
In another talk, we have heard about this problem of regulation, in particular over-regulation. So hundreds, if not thousands, of new laws are made every year. Do you think this is reducing or increasing inequality?
You know, in some areas you need regulation. I deliberately didn't get into the issue of what form is most appropriate or where do you have to end up. But, you know, if you have the sort of Wild West capitalism or complete communism, none of this works. So none of this works effectively. You need to have some regulation. I saw it in Russia, for example, when I was ambassador there in 93, when I was there as a middle-level officer in 93, where you asked anyone what's going on in the country, the mafia was moving in. It was completely a Wild West sort of capitalism. And they weren't even charging income tax or putting together money saying, oh no, we are not communists anymore, we have gone the capitalist way. Until they understood that no, even for that you need to put together funds. You have to have a taxation and financial system which has to be put in place. So these are issues that need to be looked at. I don't think we have the answer to them at the moment. But there is, for each country, it's going to be different. And for each country, you have to look at the peculiar situation of that country to see what is most appropriate. There's no other way of doing it.
Okay, thank you very much once again for the presentation.